Welcome back to Sudoku Swami's Pencil and Paper Method. At the suggestion of some of my brilliant advisors, I'm going to do something right now that I normally wait until the end of the videos to do, and that is to ask you all to please subscribe to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below. It won't cost you anything, and it will go a long way to help me keep on delivering high-quality Sudoku tutorials for you absolutely free. And I would also like to encourage you to visit my website for lots of information about me and my tutorials, several Sudoku essays that you may find interesting, and I would like to invite you all to participate in my blog, which I hope to get going soon with a lot of interesting conversations. And if you are so inclined, please also visit the Sudoku Swami gift shop, where you can buy beautiful custom t-shirts and coffee mugs featuring my logo and some other humorous and catchy Sudoku phrases. You can find links to my website and to the gift shop in the description box below. Okay, thanks very much for your indulgence on all of that. All right, here we go. Today, before we solve a puzzle from start to finish at the end of this video, we're going to talk about the concept of uniqueness in Sudoku puzzles. If you have watched all the lessons in this series, then you already know that in order to be considered valid, a Sudoku puzzle must have only one unique solution, and we're going to call this the uniqueness principle. And since 99.9% of all published Sudoku puzzles you find anywhere are going to be valid, i.e. they will have only and exactly one solution, we can sometimes take advantage of this fact to help us make certain deductions. So assuming your puzzle is valid, any configuration that would lead to multiple solutions can be deemed impossible. Consider this puzzle. If you saw this configuration, you would know immediately that this is an invalid puzzle. Why? Because you could solve this position two different ways, and neither way would violate the basic rules of Sudoku, but they would violate the one unique solution requirement, i.e. they would violate the uniqueness principle. This puzzle could be solved like this with the 2 8s here and the 2 6s here. Or it could be solved with the 2 6s here and the 2 8s here. And both of those ways would comply with there being all 9 digits in every row, column, and block with no repeats and no number left out. I encourage you to stop the video and examine each of these solutions one at a time to test this and convince yourself that both of these solutions obey the basic rules of Sudoku, and you will see what I mean. Here they are again. Solution 1 and Solution 2. These 4 cells are typically referred to as a unique rectangle that we will sometimes abbreviate as a UR or a UR pattern. So the elimination of any candidate or the placement of any digit that would lead to a configuration like this cannot be allowed. This pattern is said to be forbidden, and you will hear me use this term from time to time. It is forbidden because it would imply an invalid puzzle, i.e. it would lead to multiple solutions and would therefore violate the uniqueness principle. Now there are about 10 different ways we can use these URs to make various deductions when we can see all of the remaining candidates. And if you are interested, I cover 7 of these ways in my complete course in tutorials number 20 and number 21. They are 2 of my most popular videos. But unfortunately, when we are doing puzzles with pencil and paper, most of the time we will only be able to use and benefit from one of those 10 ways. And that is with a unique rectangle type 1. In a UR type 1, 3 of the 4 cells will be identical bi-value cells, which will allow us to make deductions about the 4th cell in the rectangle. Like if we had something that looked like this, and we knew for sure that these 3 cells were indeed bi-value cells, we would know that this 4th cell could not and cannot contain a 1 or a 3, or it would lead to the forbidden pattern as I demonstrated a minute ago. If we put a 1 in this cell, it would lead to this, and if we put a 3 in this cell, it would lead to this. which would further lead to two separate solutions that would both satisfy the basic rules of Sudoku. But having two solutions would violate the uniqueness principle, which further tells us that this red cell cannot contain a 1 or a 3. So if early on we had entered one or both of those candidates into that cell for whatever reason, we could now safely eliminate them. And if that fourth cell were empty when we recognize these three other cells as being identical bi-value cells, we would know that a 1 or a 3 could not possibly be placed in that cell, and knowing this can many times lead to other deductions. But please be aware that these three cells must be identical bi-value cells. There cannot be any other possibilities for those three cells, or this is not going to work. Remember, as I have pointed out many times in previous lessons, when we are only entering candidates here and there in strategic locations, and we are not seeing all the possible candidates for each and every cell in the puzzle, we must always pay special attention to cells with only two candidates showing. Because sometimes they will be bi-value cells, and sometimes they will not be bi-value cells. Because there may be other possibilities for that cell that we have not entered yet, and so we just can't see them at that moment. But whenever we identify a naked pair, then we know for sure that those two cells are identical bi-value cells. So maybe a good way to identify this pattern is to think of it as two connected naked pairs that are perpendicular to each other, forming a right angle, like you see here. We have a naked pair in row 2, and we have another naked pair in column 6. And together with this fourth cell, they form a rectangle. But one of the very most important things to remember is that URs will only work when the four cells lie in exactly 2 rows, 2 columns, and 2 blocks. Let me repeat this. The concept of unique rectangles will only work when the 4 cells lie in exactly 2 rows, 2 columns, and 2 blocks. This is critical. In order to form the shape of a rectangle, they must, of course, lie in 2 rows and 2 columns. That's a no-brainer. Otherwise, the 4 cells would not form a rectangle. So it could look like this, like this, like this, or like this. And it can even look like this. But please note that it cannot look like this. If the 4 cells of the rectangle lie in 4 blocks like this, then the uniqueness principle does not apply. When the 4 cells lie in 4 separate blocks, it will not necessarily lead to multiple solutions, so it is not forbidden. Thus, if you think you see a UR pattern but the 4 cells lie in 4 different blocks, then there is nothing you can do, okay? The UR pattern must lie in exactly 2 rows, 2 columns, and 2 blocks. Don't forget that. The 4-block exception is one of the most common mistakes people make when dealing with UR patterns of any kind, not just type 1. All right, now let's take a look at some real examples and some real puzzles. Here in column 3, we have a naked pair of 5 and 6, and in row 3, we have another naked pair of 5 and 6. And because those are naked pairs, we know that those are 3 identical bi-value cells, which means together with this cell, they form a unique rectangle type 1, which means that a 5 or a 6 cannot be placed in that blue cell. But before we deal with that, let's take a look at what else is going on here. We've got a naked pair of 7 and 2 in row 3, and we've got another naked pair of 7 and 2 in column 8. And it looks like with this cell, they also form a unique rectangle, but this is not a unique rectangle. These 4 cells lie in 4 different blocks, so that is not a unique rectangle. That violates the 2-block rule. The rectangle over here with the 5 and the 6 lies in 2 rows, 2 columns, and 2 blocks, so that is a real unique rectangle. But we have a naked pair of 7 and 2 in row 3 and another naked pair of 7 and 2 in column 8. And then in block 3, we have a 2 by 2 by 2 triple. That cell can only be a 7 or an 8, and this cell can only be a 2 or an 8. And now we have another naked pair of 7 and 8 in column 7. Okay, so now let's go back to this blue cell and see what we can figure out. This blue cell cannot be a 1, it cannot be a 2, it cannot be a 3 or a 4, and we know it can't be a 5 or a 6 because those are the unique rectangle candidates. And it can't be a 7, and it can't be a 9, so it has to be an 8. That's the only possibility left for that cell. So now, if we put an 8 into that cell, this becomes a 7, and if that's a 7, this is not a 7, that's a 2, and if that's a 2, that's not a 2, and that's an 8, and we've solved that triple. And now we're going to solve all these other naked pairs. If this is a 2, that's not a 2, that's a 7. If this is a 2, that's not a 2, this is a 7. And if this is a 7, this is not a 7, and that's an 8. So we can solve all of those numbers. And so now we know that this cell must also be a 5 and a 6 because that's the only cell left in row 2. And this must be a naked pair of 2 and 3 up here in row 1, but because there's a 2 down here, this has to be the 3, and this has to be the 2. So because of that unique rectangle type 1, we were able to solve all of those digits. All right, let's go to the next one. Now here in this puzzle, we have a naked pair of 8 and 3 in column 6, and we have another naked pair of 8 and 3 in row 4. So together with this cell, they form a unique rectangle type 1. And notice that we also have a naked pair of 4 and 5 in column 1, a naked pair of 4 and 5 in row 4, and another naked pair of 4 and 5 in block 6. So now let's take a look at this blue cell. The blue cell can see a 1 and it can see a 2, and it cannot be a 3 because that is one of the UR candidates. And it can't see a 4, so it could be a 4. But it can see a 5, it can see a 6, it can see a 7, and it can't see an 8, but that's also one of the UR candidates, and it can't be a 9 because it can see that 9. So this cell has to be a 4. So that's going to solve all these naked pairs on 4 and 5. If this cell is a 4, this can't be a 4, it must be a 5. So you can erase that 5, and that is a 4. If this cell is a 5, this is not a 5, it's a 4. And if this is a 4, that's not a 4, it is a 5. And we can enter all of those numbers. Okay? And now there's only one cell left in block 4 for an 8 and a 3, and they've got to go here, but there's a 3 here, so this has to be an 8, which means this is not an 8. And if that's a 3, you can erase that 3. And if that's an 8, you can erase that 8, and you can enter all of those numbers, and we've solved the unique rectangle. And now we've got a full house here in column 2, and that must be an 8. And there are a bunch of naked pairs that we could fill in here and there, but we're not going to do that right now. I just want you to see how powerful this technique is. All right, let's go to the next example. All right, here in this puzzle, we have a naked pair of 7 and 2 in row 1, and we have a naked pair of 7 and 2 in column 4. So together with this cell, they form a unique rectangle type 1, and we know that a 7 or a 2 cannot go into that blue cell. So the only other cell left in block 5 for a 7 or a 2 is right here, but this is a 7 down here, so this has to be a 2, which makes this a 7, and that can't be a 7. If that's a 2, you can erase this 2, and that's a 7. And this must be an 8 because that's the only cell left in block 5, and we can enter all of those numbers. And then we have a full house in column 5, so that also has to be an 8. All right, next one. Here in this puzzle, we have a naked pair of 7 and 5 in column 4 and another naked pair of 7 and 5 in row 6. And together with this cell, they form a unique rectangle type 1. So we know a 7 or a 5 cannot go into that blue cell, but let's try to figure out what else that could be. This cell cannot see a 1, but it can see a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And it can't be a 5 because that is one of the UR candidates. It can see a 6. And it can't be a 7 because that's the other UR candidate, and it can see a 9. So that means it has to be a 1 or an 8. So this time, we cannot solve this cell. And when this happens, it's going to be up to you whether you want to enter those candidates or not. Now, if there were more than 2 candidates, I would say just leave it blank. But since we know for sure that the 1 and the 8 are the only 2 candidates left for that cell, you might want to put them in and then just make a mental note that that is a by-value cell. All right, let's do one more before we solve today's puzzle. Now for this last example, we're going to use a puzzle that I solved in lesson 9 of this pencil and paper series. And we got to a point in the solving of that puzzle that it looked exactly like this. And we were just about to enter a 3 into this cell because that's a full house in row 2. So let's enter that. And now we have a naked pair of 1 and 2 in block 2 and a naked pair of 1 and 2 in row 1. So together with this cell, that forms a unique rectangle type 1. And we know this blue cell cannot contain 1 and 2, so there's only one cell left for the 1 and 2 in block 3, and they must go there, which means this cell has to be a 9. So you can enter that 9, and now we have another naked pair of 1 and 2 here in column 8. So assuming you understand how this works now, let's go ahead and solve today's puzzle. Now right off the bat, we've got a naked pair and a single up here in block 1, and there are actually 3 ways you can find this. The first way is by a one-line restriction in column 3. This cell cannot be a 1 or a 5, and there are only 2 cells left in that block, so they must be 1 and 5, and then there's only 1 cell left in that block, and that must be a 4. And the second way is that this cell is actually a naked single, because it can see a 1, 2, 3, and it can't see a 4, but it can see 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So it can only be a 4, and that means these other 2 cells must be a naked pair of 1 and 5. And the last way is that because there are only 3 empty cells left in block 1, we know that's a naked triple of 1, 4, and 5, and because the 1 and the 5 block this cell, these must be the 1 and the 5, and this cell has to be a 4. So no matter how you see that, you can enter a 4 in this cell and the naked pair of 1 and 5 in these 2 cells and move on. And now these 2 1s rule column 2, and this one rules column 3, and this one rules row 6. So we can put a conjugate pair of 1s into those 2 cells. One of those 1s must be true. And now there's nothing more we can do with the 1s right now, and there's only 1 2 in the whole puzzle, so let's move to the 3s. And we've got 4 3s intersecting with block 2, okay? And so there's only 1 cell left in that block for a 3, and we can enter it just like that. And now because of these 3 3s, there's only 1 cell left in block 6 for a 3, and we can crosshatch a 3 into that cell. And now that we've entered this 3, together with this 3, we can put a conjugate pair of 3s into these 2 cells, and with this 3 and this one down here, we can put a conjugate pair of 3s into these 2 cells. Now those 4 candidate 3s form an X-wing, so we know that one diagonal pair of them will be true and the other diagonal pair will be false. So as soon as we solve or eliminate any one of them, we will know the true-false value of the other 3. And if you're not sure what an X-wing is, please go back and watch lesson number 10 in this series. All right, so now the 3s are accounted for in all 9 blocks. We have 3, 3, 3, conjugate pair, 3, 3, conjugate pair, 3, 3. So we know there's nothing more we can do with them right now, so let's move to the 4s. And because of this 4 and this 4, we can put a conjugate pair of 4s into those 2 cells. And because of these 2 4s and this one down here, we can put a conjugate pair of 4s into those 2 cells. And I think that's it for the 4s, so let's move to the 5s. And because of the presence of these 3 5s, we can crosshatch a 5 into that cell. That must be a 5. And because of this 5, and this 5, we can crosshatch another 5 into that cell, and we can enter both of those 5s. All right? And now that we've entered that, we can put a conjugate pair of 5s into these 2 cells, and notice they form an X-wing with these 2 5s over here in block 1. And down here, these 2 5s rule rows 7 and row 8. So we can put a conjugate pair of 5s into these 2 cells, but one of these 5s up here must be true, so this can't be a 5. And this cell must be a 5. So we can enter that, and now the 5s are accounted for in all 9 blocks. Conjugate pair, 5, conjugate pair, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. So let's move to the 6s. And now because of this 6 in column 5 and this one in column 6, we know a 6 must go into that cell, so we can enter that. And now that that 6 is there, we know a 6 must go into this cell, and we can enter that. And now that that's in there, and this 6 up here, we know we can put a conjugate pair of 6s into those 2 cells, and we can also put a conjugate pair of 6s into those 2 cells. And now let's take a look at row 4. We've got a 7 and a 6 in that row, and they block these 3 cells, okay? So that means a 7 and a 6 can only go into those 2 cells, and you can enter that as a naked pair. That is a one-line restriction. And now there are only 2 cells left in block 9, and they must be 7 and 2 and 7 and 2. So that is another naked pair. Now these 4 7s are related in such a way that if we solve one of these 2 7s in column 7, we're going to know the value of the other 3. But if we solve this one or this one, then we will only know the solution to those individual naked pairs. All right, so now let's move to the 7s. Because of this 7 in row 9, and one of these 2 cells must be a 7, and we've got a 7 here in column 1, we can put a conjugate pair of 7s into these 2 cells. And there's nothing we can do with 7 in block 4 or block 3, so let's move to the 8s. And now we have 4 8s intersecting with block 7. Okay? So there's only one cell left in that block for an 8, and that's got to go there. So that cell has to be an 8. And because this was a conjugate pair on 6, we can erase that 6, and this must be a 6. So it can't be a 7, and this must be a 7, and we can solve those 3 cells because that was a conjugate pair on the 7s as well. So those are 8, 7, and 6. And now we have a full house in row 9. We might as well enter that too. And now because we've just entered this 7 and this 6, we can put some conjugate pairs here in block 4. Because of these 2 7s, one of these cells must be a 7. And because of these 2 6s and this 6 over here, one of these cells must be a 6. So we can put both of those conjugate pairs in there. All right, so let's go back to the 8s. Because of these 2 8s, we can put a conjugate pair of 8s into these 2 cells. And because of this 8 all by itself blocking column 5, we can put a conjugate pair of 8s into those 2 cells. And there's nothing we can do with 8 in block 2, so let's take a look at row 8. We've only got 2 cells left, and they must be 2 and 4, but there's a 4 up here, so this cell has to be the 2, and this cell has to be the 4, so you can erase that 4. You can enter the 2 and the 4, and there's only one cell left in block 8, so that must be a 1, and we can fill that in. Now we have a naked pair in column 5, and they must be 1 and 9, but because of this 9, this has to be the 1, and this has to be the 9. And because we know this is the 1, this cannot be a 1, and we can solve that cell for 1, this cell for 1, and this cell for 9. And now in block 5, we have a naked pair of 8 and 2 and 8 and 2, and in column 6, we have a naked pair of 8 and 2 and 8 and 2. So what is this? Well, what do you know? We have a unique rectangle type 1. And we know this blue cell cannot contain an 8 or a 2, right? So the 8 and the 2 must go in this cell, but because there's a 2 over here, this must be the 8. So we can solve that cell for 8, and this is going to break the puzzle wide open. If that's an 8, this cannot be an 8, that must be a 2. And there's only one cell left in block 2, that has to be a 1. So now if this is an 8, this is not an 8. And if this is a 2, this is not a 2. And these cells must be 2 and 8. So if this is a 1, this can't be a 1, that has to be a 5. And that can't be a 5, must be a 1. And because this is a 5, this can't be a 5. Remember, that was an X-wing on the 5, so this has to be a 5. And now this 8 will negate this 8, which means this cell has to be an 8 and cannot be a 6. So this must be a 6. And that means this cannot be a 6, it must be a 7. And that means this is not a 7, that must be a 6. And if this is a 7, you can erase this 7, and that is a 7. And this 6 will negate this 6, and that was a conjugate pair. So this cell has to be a 6, and it can't be a 3. And we've solved the X-wing on 3, and those 2 3s must be true, and this one must be false. So you can erase that 3. And so because of that unique rectangle type 1, we can enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 cells. Now, if we hadn't noticed that unique rectangle, this puzzle probably would have taken another 5 to 10 minutes to solve. But because we were able to enter all those numbers at once, it will only take a minute or 2 to fill in these last few cells. So let's get rid of these colors. And now up here in row 1, we have a full house, so this cell must be a 2. And in row 3, we have another full house. This cell must be a 9. Now we have a naked pair of 1 and 4 in column 9, and because there's a 1 over here, this cell has to be the 4, and this must be the 1. So you can erase that 4, and that must be a 1, and you can enter those 3 numbers. Now there's only one cell left in block 3, that has to be a 7, but there's a 7 down here, so you can erase that. And because this was a naked pair, you can erase that too, and enter those 3 numbers. Now we have a naked pair in row 4, they must be 9 and 2, so because there's a 9 here, this has to be the 2, this has to be the 9, and now we have a full house in row 6, that has to be a 2, leaving 4 and 9 for these 2 cells, and there's a 9 up here, so this has to be the 4, this has to be the 9, and this has to be a 4, and this has to be a 9, and the puzzle is solved. So you can see that that unique rectangle really sped this thing up, so you should definitely keep your eye out for those at all times. Okay, that's going to do it for today. If you enjoyed this video, please click the red subscribe button, the thumbs up icon, and be sure to click the little bell icon if you would like to be notified of new video uploads. And don't forget, if anyone has a puzzle from a newspaper, a magazine, a puzzle book, or whatever that you would like to see me solve in a future video, please send it to me at sudokuswami@gmail.com, okay? In the next lesson, before we solve a puzzle from start to finish, we're going to talk about how we can utilize the implications of triples and quads without actually filling them in. So I hope to see you all right back here for that. In the meantime, be well and be happy.